I'm Michael Tice. I practice osteopathy, obviously, out here in Winnipeg. Last year, I completed my thesis research. It was titled Andrew Taylor Still's Conception of Immunity, Its Essence and Application. And I have the pleasure of telling you about it today. The research was conducted from 2016 to April of 2020, when the topic suddenly became all the more relevant. So to be clear, it's not going to be an introduction today, not even a synopsis of the topic. I'm not going to try and represent the full complexity of Still's immunological understanding in an hour, nor to present to all of you even just the major findings of the research. So if this is Still's conception of immunity, then this presentation will be in about this much detail. So maybe even just like this, just to say that there's a lot of important material that's being left out here today. If you want, you can download the complete study from my website, stillnessosteopathy.com/immunity. There's also an introductory article there and some other relevant material. So that being said, for example, we're not going to address Still's opinion of smallpox vaccination or the unorthodox substitute for smallpox vaccination that Still himself innovated using the topical application of a caustic substance derived from beetles, but that is in the paper. Nor are we going to go over the wider context of Still's major pre-osteopathy influences, other than to say that Still was originally trained in the traditional orthodox medical system, the miasmatic model of disease. This was the concept where invisible poisonous gases carry the seeds of disease into a host. But these disease seeds can only germinate and grow if they encounter the proper internal conditions. And Still remained a lifelong adherent of this theory and strongly incorporated it into his development of osteopathy. But we'll come back to that in just a second. The reason I dove into this research is that I was curious what Still's immunological understanding was, because we might then best understand how Still practically applied that immunological understanding, so that most importantly, we could then determine if there's any aspects of Still's immunological understanding that can enhance modern osteopathic practice. This is to say that the fundamental goal of all of this is clinical applicability so that we can better serve our patients. And now for a bit of background. In the process of conducting the study, a pattern became clear. As the initial literature review was conducted for the research proposal, within the later key informant interviews, within the historical and modern osteopathic literature that was found to be relevant to the topic, in all of these, it became apparent that there's widespread agreement or simply demonstration that Still's conception of immunity has been largely lost, disregarded, and misunderstood by the osteopathic profession itself, and that this has taken place continuously from Still's own era up to today. Which brings us to today, and perhaps this painting is a pretty good synopsis of where things are at in the wider world right now, yeah? Which is just to say that solutions are urgently required to address a whole host of interrelated issues. So if Still's claims regarding osteopathy's immunological utility are true to any significant degree, then a modern revisiting of his understanding of immunity would be so valuable, as it could provide means of addressing many of today's most pressing concerns. Just a few of many possible examples being the global pandemic that began in the final weeks of conducting this research, the emergence of multi-drug resistant pathogens and their increasing relevance in modern medical practice, the economic costs of orthodox technological healthcare, which thereby means orthodox medical care is inaccessible to much, if not most, of the world's population and is likely to remain so, and simply the general issue of prevention and resilience in the face of disease, which is not being adequately addressed within the dominant orthodox medical model. I could go on, but as we all know, anxiety and depression suppress immune function, so we'll leave it at that for now. I'd like to take a moment now to emphasize that we modern osteopaths are incredibly lucky. We have access to so many documents and literature from Still's life that no osteopaths up to this point have had access to. And not only that, but we can engage with all of this material with incredible ease from almost anywhere in the world on the internet. So this is a link to the Kirksville Museum's online archive. It has all of Still's books, every article that Still wrote for the Journal of Osteopathy, and many important texts by the early osteopaths. It's all free. It can all be downloaded directly from the site without even signing up or anything. And the documents in books are therefore text searchable, meaning that, for instance, if you want to find Still's description of his method for manually passing gallstones from the gallbladder into the intestines, you can do that quickly and easily by searching an entire book with one click of your mouse. And the reason that I'm emphasizing this is that I want you to keep in mind that many, if not most of these texts, including half of Still's books, for all practical purposes, only became available for the first time ever in the 1990s or even later. And even then, only in physical print until quite recently. So this means that much of the lineage of osteopathy has taken place without access to these foundational texts, to Still's own books that he wrote for his students. And as I mentioned, in many respects, this shows in the disharmony between Still's teachings and much of current curriculum. I know that is a big claim to make at the outset here, but let me back that up just a bit or give some context for it by quickly describing some of the research methodology I followed to arrive at these findings. So 372 sources of literature were incorporated into the research, and 63 of those were texts by Andrew Taylor Still. The basic themes that emerged from engaging with those materials led to the seeking out of modern individuals who have a relevant, specialized knowledge of the themes that emerged. 9 such individuals from 4 countries participated in this study as key informants. The final paper came out at 723 pages, but don't let that put you off checking it out for yourself. It's actually quite readable. It's just really, really long. So as I mentioned, the study was conducted over 4 years, and with 20 formal hours per week being devoted to it throughout that. So in that time frame, I personally retyped a large portion of Still's writings into my database. This gave me a better appreciation for the cadence of Still's thought, and to a degree, it was a literal means of following in his footsteps. At the very least, it forced me to consider every single one of his words. By the end of the research, my copies of Still's books looked like this, and you can see that I've returned to the text many times with new insights emerging during each reading. This was part of the immersion crystallization data analysis method that was employed, which is just a fancy way of saying that I completely obsessed over this topic for way too long. You can just ask my poor wife about that. I kept a notepad beside my bed so that when I woke up with a new insight, I could immediately write it down. My morning yoga practice also spontaneously yielded fresh insights. Then throughout the day, while treating patients in my clinic, I constantly tested the accuracy of these new understandings by applying them and observing the clinical outcomes over time. Though the research has stopped, this clinical investigation is pretty much going to continue as long as I'm still alive. And the point I'm trying to make here is that though this was qualitative research, it didn't take place primarily on a computer screen. As much as possible, this material was engaged with experientially and clinically. This is the benefit of a 4-year research timeline. It was long enough for me to learn how to learn, and then the topic and the researcher each eventually merged with the other. As a result of the cyclic process of research, the emergent meanings became woven together, which allowed an overarching essence or a story to present itself, and from that story, a narrative account was given, that being the answer or the response to each of the initial questions. So now let's discuss the really interesting stuff, those findings and their potential for modern clinical application. So the traditional orthodox miasmatic model of disease that I mentioned earlier, the one that Still was raised inside of and was originally trained in, that model held that the process of disease was a type of internal rot that led to fermentation, an exponential spread of pathological influence from one individual to others within a community, or from a localized area within an individual's body, spreading outwards, eventually consuming the entire individual. Dandelions. They are invasive and must be stopped, right? The only options are to either cut them out or poison them. At least that's the mainstream cultural narrative. I personally love dandelions, and so do the bees in my garden. Yet notice that within a mature forest, no one's poisoning or cutting out the dandelions, and yet not a single dandelion can be found. But surely their seeds are continuously carried into the forest on the wind. There are no dandelions in the woods because the soil conditions are not conducive to the existence of dandelions. This is exactly how Still viewed the human body, as an internal soil that must be kept in the proper condition so that the disease seeds to which we are all constantly exposed don't have the circumstances that they require to germinate, take root, mature, and then exponentially reproduce. This internal soil was composed, in Still's mind, of what would today be called the interstitial or extracellular space, including the terminal vessels flowing into and out of that space. Still referred to this as the fascia, or sometimes the lymphatics. Still's understanding of the structure-function dynamics governing this scale was highly prescient and remain accurate even when compared to modern orthodox descriptions of the same. In fact, I would argue that in many regards, and especially in terms of practical application, even now, Still's understanding of this domain remains more highly nuanced and developed. So let's jump straight into some Stillian observation and pattern recognition in the world at large. This is a satellite photo of a mountain range and its associated watersheds. This is the internal surface of a human's right parietal bone. And this is an aerial photograph of a confluence within a river system. And this is the lambda of a human skull. This is the left temporal and right scapula from the same individual. And this is their left scapula and right innominate. This image is taken from a field guide for forensic investigators. It cautions them to avoid confusing the left perinatal scapula with the right pars lateralis, that being the occipital segment that composes the right lateral border of the foramen magnum. And on this next slide, real quick, what bone are we looking at here? The innominate? In fact, this is the superior surface of C1, the atlas. It seems everywhere we look within reality, form is composed of a repetition of self-similar forms, repeated on a variety of scale. If our perspective zooms in or it zooms out, eventually we encounter the very same form. The human form is but one more instance of this same phenomenon. Still also recognized that this pattern takes place throughout all of reality, and he wrote about it multiple times. For instance, Still said, "In the sky, we have constellations of worlds. In the body, constellations of molecules. In the sky, we have rain clouds. In the body, lying alongside the veins, are the lymphatics. This analogy may be carried out indefinitely." So is this all just neato? Or is it a signpost pointing towards an essential meaning that may then powerfully inform practical application? Still proposed that this omnipresence of self-similar, coherent organization taking place throughout all of reality was indicative of a fundamental principle being the source of the pattern. Still was proposing that the pattern is the many similar effects of a single cause, a single cause. This is only one of the reasons why it's so vital to engage with Still's worldview if we are to best comprehend his personal conception of immunity. Still's worldview, that is to say, Still's understanding of reality in general, was what he then later applied in particular to the practice of medicine, eventually referring to this application as osteopathy. Still was very clear about the genesis and actual foundation of his osteopathy. For example, when Still said, "How was it then, I am asked, that I thought of osteopathy? I first saw the tracks of God in the snow of time, and I followed them." Still's osteopathy was not about bones. This repetition of form taking place on a variety of scales throughout reality can be referred to as the holographic principle. If you take a hologram and you rip it in half, each half does not display a portion of the image, as would happen with like a photograph, right? Rather, with a hologram, each half now displays the whole complete original image. And this is key, but as viewed from a particular perspective. Note that the lower stars are being perceived from different angles than the original photo. Super weird, right? So it's important to note that Still is not the only one to come to these conclusions and then be convinced of their foundational relevance to human inquiry. For example, take this quote from one of the most important and well-respected physicists of the 20th century, David Bohm. In some sense, man is a microcosm of the universe. Therefore, what man is a clue to the universe. David Bohm in 1986. This is in fundamental agreement with Still's holographic worldview, wherein Still said, I see in man a miniature universe, saying that in 1908. And take these images that have never been available before our modern era. One of these is a slice showing the neurons in a mouse's brain, and the other is a compiled image of an incomprehensibly vast expanse of space in which clusters of galaxies are visible. Clusters of galaxies. So which of these is the perspective of a microscope looking at a mouse's neuron, and which is a telescope looking out at like an incomprehensibly large amount of space? It's not just a striking juxtaposition of these two similar images. In fact, these images are the result of a recent study carried out by an astronomer and a neurologist. As a team, they conducted a quantitative analysis of the spatial arrangements of the networks of neurons floating inside their cerebrospinal fluid and of these galaxy clusters floating inside the fluidic sea of dark matter and energy. So it would seem that reality in general and reality in particular mirror each other. In short, this is how Still conceptualized and experienced reality, his worldview. He experienced reality as a whole, a single phenomenon, a unity manifesting itself as a multiplicity of expressions. In one instance, Still used the image of a tree to convey this to his readers. He said something along the lines that, much the same as a single tree expresses itself as roots, trunk, branches, leaves, and fruit, yes, each of these expressions is the tree, but none of them individually is the tree itself. Neither is the sum total of these expressions the tree itself. Rather, the tree is something other than its expressions, yet each expression is simultaneously the tree, present in that moment as that manifestation. This was the shift in perspective that Still traversed in the course of his life. From what would today be categorized as a monotheistic worldview, wherein a separate divine creator in the past brought into existence an unchanging universe, right? Like within that Judeo-Christian tradition, 6 days of creation, all the animals and planets and stars were formed in those 6 days, and they've ceaselessly existed ever since. Whereas in Still's life, he moved into what would now be categorized as a panentheistic worldview. This is a worldview wherein the ultimately unknowable divine ground of reality is continuously manifesting itself as the universe, yet is not limited to that manifestation. Importantly, this then includes humanity. As Still said, I see in man a miniature universe. In Still's worldview, the individual and the divine whole are reflections each of the other. They are the very same phenomenon, only taking place on different scales. In a number of instances within Still's writing, he is explicit. From his perspective, each human, himself and each of his patients, was a branch, a manifestation of the single sacred unity. Thus, when Still refers to God, he is not referring to the Judeo-Christian deity that he was raised with. Rather, Still is using this term to refer to his subsequent revised definition of the sacred, a sacred that is in constant evolution and yet is constant. When Still says God, he is pointing his listeners to that which manifests itself as time and space. This is why Still interchangeably used the term God with the terms the infinite and the unknowable. All three of these terms Still was using to refer to the unformed, that which has no character except the potential for all possible characteristics, the infinite. A question such as a discussion such as this is not only valid, but it's actually completely necessary to understand Still's conception of immunity, given that Still's revised definition of God was the foundation of osteopathy. Take, for instance, Still's very first book, his autobiography. This is a book of 460 pages, wherein Still uses those terms, the unknowable, 3 times, and the infinite, 17 times, and God, 235 times. And these were only some of the terms that Still used to refer to the divine ground of reality. Still had dozens of terms that he used, and they're all cataloged in the study if you're curious. Now, for comparison, in that same book, Still refers to osteopathy only 214 times, less than he refers to divinity. So this all may be very philosophically or biographically interesting, but let's make no mistake, it's also much more than that, because Still was not just a philosopher or a mystic, he was also a clinician. And Still's osteopathy is the practical application of this worldview. One of the fundamental distinctions between the osteopathic and orthodox medical traditions is that when looking at the human being, the orthodox medical system perceives a series of objects or parts. And then they seek out a complete understanding of each of these parts through a process of intense isolation. If we can pull everything else back, we can understand this, right? Whereas Still's osteopathy perceives the human being as a single integrated unity, an indivisible whole whose complexity is infinite and thus will always surpass the human capacity for total comprehension. So now note that these two perspectives, the orthodox and the osteopathic, are both observing the same phenomenon. Yet it's the perspective, the worldview itself, that dictates the therapeutic intervention that is then deemed to be appropriate. For example, for a very long time, the orthodox tradition has felt confident in dissecting away the fascia so that the relevant anatomy might be observed in isolation, while the osteopathic tradition has understood that if an aspect of the whole has the osteopathic tradition has understood that if an aspect of the whole has been manifested into form, then that form must therefore be integral to the normal and full expression of that whole. The point I'm trying to make here is that a medical intervention is an application of the perception, the worldview that precedes that intervention. I suspect that most osteopaths would agree that to lose this distinction between the orthodox and the osteopathic worldviews would be to lose the very essence and practice of Still's osteopathy. Yet, how is it then that today's osteopathy often feels increasingly comfortable falling into complete harmony with the fragmented orthodox medical worldview? Not so much when it comes to human anatomy, but to the whole of reality itself. For just as in the human body, when the orthodox perspective looks out at the universe, it again only perceives parts, nothing but solitary objects, assumed to be best understood by observation within imposed isolation. Still's osteopathy was not just a vision of the human being wherein the unity was acknowledged as the fundamentally relevant characteristic, but rather, Still's osteopathy was a vision of all of reality, wherein indivisibility, unity, was acknowledged as the fundamentally relevant characteristic. Just as on the scale of immunology, where the self is best understood in relation to the non-self, so too, on the largest of possible scales, the human individual can be best understood in the context of the universal, or at least that's how Still saw it. A truly holistic vision of a human being cannot take place within a larger vision of reality that is itself fragmented. The results of a fragmented or a unified perspective are the same on either of these scales. So these findings would suggest that today's osteopathic practitioner who wishes to meet or exceed Still's historical scope of practice, his clinical results, and his ability to spontaneously innovate in the face of new problems, such a practitioner would do well to study Still's worldview as a highly practical subject. So again, it becomes clear that Still's osteopathy was not about bones. The context for Still's medical system was the universe as a whole. This was the vantage point from which Still viewed his individual patient. And please accept what I'm going to say here not as a criticism, but rather as the results of this research process. So does it not make sense then if an osteopath is only asking themselves, which structure is immobile? Would this not be a very superficial engagement with the full possible depth of Still's osteopathic medical model, which would then explain why a comparatively superficial perspective such as this would yield only comparatively superficial clinical outcomes and scope of practice? So now that this sweeping context for Still's conception of immunity has been presented, putting it into clinical practice then involves investigating how is it that the divine, undifferentiated, formless unity comes to present itself as this appearance of separate individualized phenomena? How is it that these patterns, such as the neuron and the galaxy clusters, the watershed and the parietal vascular pathways, how is it that these patterns first emerge and then not only persist, but evolve and develop into new forms throughout time and space? Basically, what is life? These are the questions that Still fundamentally obsessed over, the questions that he found to be of fundamental relevance to appropriate medical practice. How do we define a self? How does a self emerge from non-self? And how does a self perpetuate and evolve within the larger context of non-self? Again, if all of this sounds rather philosophical and impractical, please note that modern orthodox immunology holds the relationship between self and non-self to be the foundational concept of the entire field of study. If we as osteopaths are to fundamentally engage with immunology, we cannot gloss over our definition and theory of self. In understanding the processes that form and perpetuate a biological individual, Still drew strongly on the work of the British philosopher Herbert Spencer. Thus, Still arrived at the conclusion of an individualized life, a being, thinking that it can be best understood as a region of coherently organized motion. This was in Still's mind the best way to define a biological individual was as a region of coherently organized motion. That region of coherence exists in relation to the exterior, the non-self. So to maintain internal coherence, the self must continuously evolve the resonant harmony of its internal coherence, while also maintaining the harmony of that resonance in relation to the influence of the exterior. At the same time, the self must take in or integrate external motion and transform that momentum or energy, right, into compatibility with the resonant harmony of the interior. Though that harmony of the interior, like we said, is completely evolving and spontaneous, never the same, infinite yet a pattern in its expression. So vice versa, aspects of the interior must also constantly cross the boundary, exit the self, and become non-self once again. This is all to say that an individual, for it to exist, a ceaseless, harmonized, reciprocal exchange must take place. A balance of inflow and outflow crossing that boundary that defines self from non-self. And on the level of a biological organism, examples of inflow would be food, water, inhaled air, while outflow examples would be things like feces, urine, exhaled air, sweat, or even heat. So from this viewpoint, a biological individual is best understood to be a process rather than an object. So there goes our efforts towards objectivity, yes? Okay. meaning that adaptation is not something that you do, it is what you are. Or as Norbert Wiener, the American mathematician who founded the field of cybernetics, put it, our tissues change as we live. The food we eat and the air we breathe become flesh and bone of our bone, and the momentary elements of our flesh and bone pass out of our body every day with our excreta. We are but whirlpools in a river of ever-flowing water. We are not stuff that abides, but patterns that perpetuate themselves. Just like that standing wave in the photo there, right? It's the same wave, but it's always different water. And yet it's never exactly the same wave because it's infinitely changing and evolving over time through space. So Still had concluded that the same force that initially gives rise to an individual is then the very same force that perpetuates that individual through time and space. So this all serves to illustrate that Still saw growth and regeneration, which is to say metabolism, and defense, which is to say immunity, as but two branches of the very same tree, two expressions of the single universal force of spontaneous, appropriate self-organization. That's a modern term that was found to be in harmony with Still's thinking. He was very far ahead of his time. So this understanding, this viewpoint, is in fact the very origin of the word organism. An organism is an instance of organization. An organism is an organized coherence of motion, perpetuated and evolving through time and space. It is not a material object. To Still, death and disease was not caused by the presence of abnormal disease processes. Rather, death and disease was the natural outcome of an absence or a lack of appropriate self-organization. Thus, at its essence, Still's medical intervention did not consist of freeing the patient of agents of disease or of freeing them of mechanical obstructions, nor was it to normalize the patient's anatomy and physiology. Rather, Still's ultimate therapeutic intention was to provide the universal force of self-organization with an unimpeded region in which it might act. Still was not a master of dictating outcomes of his interventions. Rather, he possessed an incredible trust in the wisdom of the patient's own inherent capacity to perfectly and appropriately adapt, to express themselves. This was what Still's philosophical medical model consisted of. This is the essence of his osteopathy. Still's osteopathy sought to facilitate the restoration of a normality of autonomy. That's a phrase that I came to in the course of this research, and it's just like my mind can sit with that endlessly in the clinic. Or as Still put it, thus we can do no more than feed and trust the laws of life as nature gives them to man. We're not the one at the driver's wheel. The boundary between self and non-self is what determines the inflow and outflow of that region of self-organization, that region of coherently organized motion. Thus, in medical practice, Still focused on the dynamics crossing that boundary on whatever scale of self-organized unit. Still focused on the dynamics crossing that boundary on whatever scale of self-organized unit was found to be relevant at that moment. So perhaps this was the boundary that delineates one tissue type from the tissues surrounding it, such as with a nerve or a fluid transport vessel. But perhaps it was the boundary defining an organ, or a bodily region, or a pressure volume, or perhaps the whole individual. So on any of those scales, it's the ratio of inflow versus outflow across the boundary that determines the amount of content that is then present at any one moment within the collection space of that self-organized unit. Okay? So think of a bathtub with the inflow, with the faucet and the drain, and it's like The rate of the water coming in from the faucet versus the size and amount of water that can come out the drain determines how much water is in the bathtub at any one time. So, and then it's the ratio between those two, in the inflow and the outflow, that determines how much collection or how much content is in that collection space. Okay. So Still described many varieties of inflows and outflows, but his primary therapeutic focus was on fluids. And so it's this rate of the ratio of fluid in versus fluid out that determines whether swelling or stagnation occur, or deficiency and atrophy, or health. This was primarily what Still was referring to when he spoke of the fascia. Still saw the interstitial region as a collection space for the fluids that carry the building blocks of life in and the waste products out. So please note that this is also an accurate modern description of the anatomy of metabolism. This same understanding of fluid flow dynamics was applied by Still to the innate defensive capacities of the individual. Still understood and taught that normal immune function requires constant appropriate fluid flow. Otherwise, it can become catastrophically pathological. Which brings us back to, or now brings us to, beavers, who are renowned for their ability to intentionally create an environment that provides for their own defense and nourishment. This is exactly what both pathogens and malignant growths do. It's exactly what both pathogens and malignant growths do. Within their host, they intentionally disrupt the ratio of inflow versus outflow of fluid as a means of disabling the host's immune functions, while simultaneously providing the nutritive and defensive conditions that allow the pathogen or the malignancy to thrive. Much of this is accomplished by alterations of vascular permeability. So Still wrote about this scenario and its clinical importance constantly. Like it's the punctuation throughout his texts is the mentioning of this scenario over and over and over again. And let's take this beaver metaphor a step further. You can poison the beavers or cut them out, but the beaver's dam and all of the alterations that it has brought about in the hydrology of the landscape, that's going to remain indefinitely, even though the beavers are dead. These are the findings of recent orthodox immunology. The best predictor of the transition from HIV to AIDS is not the pathogen load of the host. It's the state of the host's immune function. Pathogens may act as the origin of many infectious diseases, but the pathogen can be completely eradicated from the host by the host's immune response, and yet the host will nevertheless continue to sicken and eventually die as a result of the process of disease that was merely initiated by the pathogen. The host, in that case, the host has lost the ability to coherently organize and adapt its internal harmonic motion. So what then is the relevant definition of disease? Is it the presence of a pathogen on a lab test? And what is the most relevant arena of intervention? The pathogen or the disease process? A pathogen disrupts the normal ratio of fluid in versus fluid out in many ways. It also manipulates the host's own immune modulators, cytokines. That's one means as well that it uses cytokines to disrupt the normal fluid flow ratios, because cytokines influence vascular permeability. So this leads to a immunopathology, which can eventually become exponentially dysregulated. Orthodox immunology refers to that process as a cytokine storm. So this is to say that once a disease process gets rolling, if the host is unable to reharmonize, the disease process becomes an exponential avalanche. This includes the immunopathology of a cytokine storm. Like, cytokine storms are the mechanism behind sepsis, and that's the leading cause of death worldwide in ICUs, even right now. Many, if not most, infectious diseases, like the 1918 Spanish flu and COVID, even autoimmune disorders, All of these conditions centrally involve that cytokine storm dynamic, disrupting vascular permeability and disrupting fluid flow ratios. And let me add that from the findings of this research, while COVID-19 may be a novel human pathogen, the pathological disease process that that virus induces is universally common. We've seen this before many times. It's one slightly different instance of a pattern that repeats itself infinitely, yeah? So this is to say that in the majority of cases, it's not the presence of the pathogen that kills a patient, it's the poor ratio between the damage done to the pathogen by their immune response and the damage done to the patient by their own dysregulated immune response. A hugely relevant aspect of this is that regulation of fluid flow dynamics. Pathogens and malignant growths intentionally initiate the immunopathology of a cytokine storm just the same way as a beaver builds a dam, because the pathogens or the malignancy also want easy access to their preferred food and a strong defensive capacity. What they don't want is a fair and open fight within well-regulated flowing fluids, because a pathogen or a malignancy is very likely to lose the battle in those conditions. So this picture here, this castle with the invaders and the defenders, is how orthodox immunology has largely historically conceptualized an infectious disease. And that is all fine and accurate in its own way, but the dynamics in play within the model must not end there. Orthodox medical culture has essentially completely overlooked the interior of the castle and the vital roles that are being played inside of it. For example, the civilians that are putting out fires as flaming arrows are shot through the windows, or even down in the basement where food stores are being carefully managed and distributed so that the castle can endure an extended siege while it waits for specialized reinforcements to arrive. So putting out a fire before it spreads, or rationing food so that you can wait until the cavalry charges in and saves the day, is just as vital a function as killing enemy soldiers, perhaps even more so. An army involves so much more than those who carry weapons in battle. All of the roles within the army are vital to success. And it's this type of supportive, adaptive, and disease resistance mechanisms that partially explain how osteopathic treatment can effectively and powerfully influence the trajectory of an infectious disease or any other disease process. This explains how manual osteopathy holds the potential to effectively prevent or even interrupt and reverse a cytokine storm, which just so happens to be in exact alignment with Still's historical understanding of fermentation and its spread. Still hammered on again and again about the errant chemical reactions that could begin in a highly localized area and then exponentially spread out to eventually influence the whole. So to recap, the historical orthodox model of infectious disease is actually very simplistic. It's perceived to be a balance between the pathogen load versus disease resistance. Thus, from that perspective, intervention would consist of either killing off the pathogen directly, such as with an antibiotic, or of increasing pathogen-specific disease resistance in advance of exposure via vaccination. But a much more nuanced and highly applicable model of infectious disease, the very one which Still was utilizing and teaching, is based on the understanding that there's more than one strategy that can beneficially tip the scales in the patient's favor. We can also seek to increase the ability to tolerate disease, to quickly, effectively, and constantly adapt to the changing disease conditions, and thereby provide immunoregulation, thus avoiding the potential for intense self-damage during immunopathology. It can circumvent immunopathology occurring at all. So this is to say that there's a profound reciprocal relationship between immunoregulation and immune function. Once again, the same pattern emerges. Orthodox immunology has now recently recognized that these two factors are but two branches of the very same tree, just as Still said. Essentially, what's being pointed to here is that a stronger regulatory capacity allows for a greater offensive efficacy. The best offense is a good defense. The best defense is a good offense. This was the understanding that informed Still's therapeutic strategy. Okay, so let's look at this little chart that I made here. And the black line is without enhanced disease tolerance, without osteopathy. Then we have our peak, and then our crest, and then it falls away in the bell curve. Yet, if we can stop it from climbing, if we can stop it from gaining momentum with each of those intervention along the time axis on the bottom there, each of those is an osteopathic treatment. We kind of keep adjusting and adjusting, helping to steer the process and the trajectory of the process, not steer, but influence it beneficially, give the system more capacity to choose the appropriate trajectory for the process, then we have a completely different trajectory, and the intensity or the velocity, the momentum of the disease process never gets nearly as high as it would otherwise. And Still successfully employed this strategy in acute, chronic, even palliative scenarios for the entire spectrum of disease conditions. He used this strategy both to prevent death and to give comfort to the dying. Still accomplished this by normalizing the flow in and flow out across the boundaries of specific scales of self-organization. So to summarize, if disease is best understood as an exponential process of the loss of ability to self-organize, and health is the regenerative outcomes of unimpeded self-organization, does it not make sense that a series of appropriately spaced anatomico-physiological renormalizations would not only decrease the likelihood and intensity of self-damage, but also increase the rate of repair and decrease the time needed to mount superior defenses, such as with adaptive immunity, right? Like learned immunity. But therefore, given all of the above, it would significantly alter the overall trajectory of the disease process, meaning that in the end, patients who receive osteopathic care not only recover faster, but they are far more likely to recover because they have so much less to recover from. They never got as sick in the first place, so they're far more likely to get back to normal and far more likely to get back to normal much more quickly. And the existing clinical research completely backs this up. So again, all of this was accomplished by Still through interaction with the rate of the flow in versus flow out across the boundary of regions of self-organization. He focused on the normalizing of fluid circulation primarily, of building blocks coming in and waste products going out. So this is to say that Still's strategy was to treat immunologically via a normalization of metabolism. And wouldn't you know it, this is the very same newly discovered relationship that is now rocking the orthodox medical community. Metabolism and immune function have been discovered to be but two sides of the very same coin. A shift in the one dictates the state of the other. This dynamic is now being referred to as immunometabolism. Put that into Google Scholar and you will be blown away about what has been learned in the past 5 years. The recent orthodox literature describes the implications of clinically applying this newfound discovery as overwhelming, paradigm shifting, revolutionary. If only we can now find a means of putting it into practice. And to me, this is Still's true genius. He not only clearly comprehended and accurately described these dynamics in the late 1800s, but he then managed to innovate a practical and effective means of therapeutically applying them. It's amazing. Yet modern osteopathy as a whole seems to be moving further and further away from Still's original vision and towards the exclusion of anything that is not evidence-based. And given this, while it's highly productive to understand osteopathy more deeply through the scientific method, the vindication of Still's historical The vindication of Still's historical immunometabolic understanding points out the fact that today's osteopathic profession must not rely on evidence-based practices alone, not unless we wish to wait another 140 years for orthodox validation of the methods that we can employ in service of our communities today. All this immunometabolic stuff has come out in the past 5 years. Still was talking about this 140 years ago. What else are we talking about now that in 140 years is finally going to gain theoretical acceptance? So there is so much more that I'd love to detail regarding how modern advances in immunology indicate the accuracy of Still's theory and practice, and the specific implications that this all holds, not only for general osteopathic practice, but in particular for treatment of patients experiencing infectious disease and cancer. But as was mentioned at the outset, this presentation is only an introduction. So we haven't even addressed all of the major findings of the study here. You can find all of that in the paper itself, and I super encourage you to check it out. But for now, if we have to choose only one important clinical application that all of this points to, let's talk about frequency of treatment. Like I was saying, intervention, intervention, intervention along the pathway as the trajectory of disease plays out, right? So, but what's the spacing of those interventions? And how long does each of those interventions last? So during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, an osteopath in Kirksville, Anne Howes, reported that her patients required 6 treatments per 24 hours, like 3 during the day, 3 during the night. And that went on for the first 3 days of their illness. So that's 18 treatments in 72 hours for a patient at the outset of such a serious infection, right? Like we're saying, but it can be far less serious if we drag back the momentum of that process so consistently like that. So the historical data would suggest that those treatments only lasted around 10 minutes, give or take. And they were so exceedingly simple, many of the techniques. Along these lines, one of the key informants who participated in this study described the synthesis that he had arrived at by sifting through all of the historical osteopathic literature related to treatment of pneumonia. And the synthesis that he came to was, the more severe it was, the more frequently they treated it, but the less amount of time they used to treat it. And that was Dr. Brian Degenhardt, who was in Toronto just a few years ago at Founders Day. It was during his key informant interview. I actually interviewed him at Founders Day. So as another example from the past, let's take a case of Andrew Taylor Still's own practice, where he's reported to have successfully treated Margaret Hildreth for the abnormal growths in her eyelids and eyes that were slowly blinding her. Still worked with Margaret once a week for 2 years straight. That is 104 successive weekly treatments by a master to resolve that condition. Or take the article that Still wrote for prospective patients of his Kirksville infirmary, informing them that, for example, in the case of asthma, patients should expect that, and this is a quote from Still, 75% of cases are curable in from 2 to 4 months, end quote. While he goes on to say, I'm paraphrasing him, that the remaining 25% of patients should expect even longer to reach resolution of their condition. So we can explicate historically again that for 2 to 4 months or longer, those patients were receiving 1 to 3 treatments a week at a duration of 10 to 20 minutes per treatment. So 1 to 3 treatments a week for 2 to 4 months, that's going to resolve your asthma. Nothing, Still is saying don't expect anything less than that. And all of these examples are radically different in their format and their scope of practice often from the modern methodology that I was introduced to within my own recent osteopathic education. All of these examples point to a foundational focus on consistent dosage and frequency of treatment as a prerequisite for successful intervention in many conditions. Let's say that Still had discovered physiotherapy instead of osteopathy, and that Still had then suggested that in the case of a severe injury, remedial exercise should be dosed 3 times per day, 20 minutes per dose for 3 months. If that was the case, then modern osteopathic practice would be doing something along the lines of giving a 60-minute or 90-minute dose once a week, or even once a month. Why then are we so surprised that today we're not getting the same level of results and don't have the same scope of practice as still in the early osteopaths? We're using the very same tools, but we're not using the same method that they did. So from this perspective, it's useful to look at frequency of treatment, like operating one of those old hand water pumps, like the picture I have here. So yes, you have to have a minimum efficiency with each stroke of the pump, each treatment. But once that's achieved, what really matters so much more is how often you pump and how long you keep pumping. The frequency is what determines whether water comes out or not, much more so than supreme efficacy within any individual pump along the way. Clinically, this is perhaps the single most relevant and most easily applied finding from this research, which is why I chose to convey it within the constraints of this short presentation. One of the important early osteopaths, Carl McConnell, put it this way: timing and spacing of treatments are too often based on fancy of some sort and not on therapeutic requirements. Probably more failures and dissatisfaction in osteopathy arise here than from all other sources combined. Success is dependent upon this, timing and spacing of treatments, as well as upon definite structural corrections. And it seems that in much of modern osteopathy, we spend a lot of time acknowledging that our interventions must be incredibly precise and accurate to be effective, and not nearly enough time discussing the frequency with which those interventions should be implemented if they are to be effective. Why did Still continue treating Margaret Hildreth for 104 weeks in a row? Was he correcting lesions? Or was he consistently positively influencing an ongoing process? This is a picture of Still climbing a pear tree. Perhaps the modern osteopathic community does not need a new fancy technique nearly so much as we need to first implement more appropriate frequency of treatment. We would do well to pick all the low-hanging fruit now, and then only go through the effort of climbing all the way to the top of the tree to get those last few elusive pears once that's done. So the historical and modern osteopathic literature indicates that shorter, more frequent treatments, often provided over a much longer timeline, would often better match our patient's biology. So there is much more in the full study regarding how and why this historical treatment framework was put into place, how it was tailored to the specific circumstances of each patient, and why it makes the most sense physiologically. But for now, how then might we implement this historical framework today? Firstly, we need to begin with incorporating awareness of the framework into modern osteopathic education. We've got to understand that phrase that Dr. Degenhardt said, that the more severe it was, the more often we treat, but the less duration of each treatment. Osteopaths have to learn that as much as possible, the frequency and duration of treatment has to be determined by biological factors, not socioeconomic ones, when possible. And I know this is super difficult, but if that's not done, the very framework of treatment itself is going to continue to be a major limiting factor in both clinical results and scope of practice because of clinical results or lack thereof. So secondly, we need to begin teaching our patients to treat themselves. Still actually suggested this multiple times within his writings. He explicitly suggested it as a means of increasing frequency of treatment because sufficient frequency is so vital to clinical outcome. So if you're an osteopath who tends to treat within longer sessions, I'm not suggesting that you should immediately and wholesale abandon that framework. But I am suggesting that you explore these theories for yourself. Perhaps experiment with 30-minute sessions. So you could explore these with family and friends, and that would be 30 minutes total for intake, assessment, and treatment. And afterwards, and this is the key, I think, see that patient again soon, within a day or two, if only to simply reassess them. And you'll likely be shocked at how much of what you didn't have time to address just a day or two before has now already shifted back towards normality. Experiencing this for yourself not only increases trust in the ability of the patient to self-correct, but it also leaves you with a more diverse skill set, and you'll be then ready to provide care in a far wider array of scenarios, and perhaps to provide care to a greater number of patients within your practice. Because I don't know about out there, but like here, like we're deluged with patients, and because there's so few of us here in Manitoba, we haven't the campus hasn't been open here nearly so long, and it's just a shame that not everyone that wants treatment is able to get treatment at this point. And this is one mechanism of at least alleviating that to a degree. So at the very least, even if a practitioner continues to work within a 60-minute framework, experimenting with these shorter sessions challenges the practitioner to develop greater efficiency, which then allows greater efficacy, no matter what time frame you're going to treat inside of. So there we go. That's all the time I have. It was a real pleasure to speak with you. I kind of feel like I was speaking to a wall because that's all I saw on the video screen here. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and got something out of it. And I really thank you, Philippe and Jane, for the opportunity to present to you all. So thank you very much.